Okay, I think we will start. I'm sure that there will be a few more people coming in as we progress, and that's perfectly fine. We welcome you here to our 36th annual Robert Kahn Memorial Lecture. Robert Kahn was an Austrian emigre and distinguished professor of history at Rutgers who focused on the Habsburg world. And obviously it's safe to say that we've never had a Kahn lecture quite like this before. So we're thankful that you're here. And again, as I said before, we ask perhaps for your patience and indulgence, but I think we're in pretty good shape. Many people have made this transition possible. We have a really wonderful support staff here at the Center for Austrian Studies, our program manager, Jennifer Hammer, Dylan Moore, our editor, Tim McDonald, the assistant editor for the Austrian History Yearbook, a fabulous supporting staff at the Institute for Global Studies, Pat Baylor and Sarah Striegel in particular. Or I should also thank Jacob Smiley, our student worker at CAS as well. And a shout out to Julia Nelson, who's come in from Berkeley, who you'll hear a little bit more about, because this is also a lecture that is being sponsored by a North American initiative of four of our North American Austrian centers. So thank you for joining us. We may have two of Robert Kahn's children with us. They said that we would try to get in for part of this, Marilyn and Peter Kahn. So a very special welcome to you as well. The Kahn Lecture is the opening event of the Center for Austrian Studies programming for the 2020-2021 academic year. And like us all, this is completely new territory for us. We will be posting our in the chat box our program. And as I just mentioned, this is also part of a joint initiative of the four North American Austrian centers. And we'll put the link in to the chat box as well. So there will be 4 lectures sponsored by each of these centers, one sponsored by each of these centers over the course of fall semester that you may be interested in participating in. Okay, I don't want to take away from our speakers' time, so I will just say in advance that I am giving a really shamefully abbreviated introduction to our speaker, Professor Tara Zahra. Professor Zahra is the Homer J. Livingston Professor of History at the University of Chicago, where she has taught since 2007. She earned her BA from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania in 1998. I mentioned that because there she worked with and met an earlier Kahn lecturer, Professor Peter Judson. Professor Zahra then went on to the University of Michigan, where she earned her PhD in 2005. She's the author of 3 very successful books, most recently, The Great Departure, Mass Migration from Eastern Europe, and The Making of the Free World. Between them, I think her books have won more than half a dozen prizes, so all very, very distinguished and very, very well received, obviously. Now, I could go as well into a long list of fellowship and prizes that she has won over the course of her career. Most prominently is the Macarthur Fellowship, and I think there's a type of really nice symmetry here. As I was sort of reviewing things, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe there's only one other Kahn lecturer who is a Macarthur Fellow, and that was our very first lecturer, Karl Schorsky. So number 1 and number 36. I could be wrong. Maybe there's somebody else in the middle there, but that's really, I think a very nice tribute here. Currently, she has 3 books in progress and will be presenting material today on one of those projects, Against the World, Deglobalization, and Anti-Globalism in Interwar Europe. So without any further ado, let me turn the presentation over to Professor Zahra, who will now take us on with the lecture.
Thank you, Howard, for the introduction. It was a huge honor to be asked to give the Kahn lecture. And it's an even greater honor to see so many friends and colleagues and strangers who have turned out to hear the lecture. This is absolutely, I think, the biggest audience I've ever given a lecture to. And it's also my first time doing a lecture on Zoom. So this is good practice for teaching remotely next week. And please bear with me. I hope I'll manage to use the technology well. Obviously, I never imagined when I was invited to give this lecture a year ago that I'd be giving it remotely from Italy on Zoom, nor that my research on deglobalization would be interrupted by deglobalization. But the silver lining is clearly getting to have so many, getting to share my work with so many of you. So I'll return to the present day at the end of the lecture, but for the moment, I want to take us back to the problems caused by deglobalization in 1919, not for academics, but for traveling salesmen. In Joseph Roth's novel, The Kapuzinergraft, a Polish count bemoans the fate of a lowly chestnut seller. Roth wrote, "He is not only a chestnut seller, but he is quite symbolic for the old monarchy. This gentleman once sold his chestnuts everywhere, through half of Europe, one might say, and everywhere where his roasted chestnuts were eaten was Austria, and the Emperor Franz Joseph reigned. Now there is no chestnut without a visa." A real Austrian traveling salesman reflected on the challenges he faced that year. Before the First World War, the Habsburg Empire had been the largest free trade zone in Europe, a paradise for traveling salesmen. Now, in addition to the enmity of neighboring countries, he had to deal with new currencies and exchange rates, tariffs and trade laws, passports and visa requirements. Plus, he had to learn new languages because nobody wanted to buy anything from a salesman speaking German. He was unsure if he would ever recover his livelihood. The struggles of the Austrian traveling salesman were not only symbolic of the monarchy's demise. For decades before the First World War, the world had seemed to shrink. Millions of migrants crossed the globe. The railway and steamship accelerated their journeys, reducing the costs and risks of travel. The world was also arriving on the doorsteps of those who stayed home via the telegraph, the radio, newspapers, cinema, exhibitions, and foreign goods. Many observers believed that the growing interconnection of people and states was unstoppable. They believed that it would produce progress, prosperity, and peace. You all know where this is going. These illusions were shattered in 1914 when the First World War ushered in a quarter century of anti-globalism. There's no question about the decline of global mobility and trade in this period. In 1914, trade accounted for 30% of the world economy, an all-time high. By 1933, it had slumped to a low of 10% and did not recover until the 1970s. Transatlantic migration, which reached its peak of 2.1 million in 1913, came to a sputtering halt during the war. And while trade, migration, and international cooperation did recover briefly during the late 1920s, the Great Depression dealt a decisive blow. The first slide I have up is an imperfect measure of this transformation. These are 3 Google Ngrams for the word autarky in English, German, and French. And you can see that there's a huge rise in the prevalence of the term in the 1920s and 30s, peaking around 1940. It was actually German, English, and Italian. The economic and political history of globalization and deglobalization, of globalization and deglobalization are, of course, critically important, and there's been a growing literature on these topics. But my focus today and in this broader project is on grassroots political and social movements that mobilized against globalism and internationalism between the wars. These actors and their movements did not actually use the term globalization or deglobalization at the time. They spoke instead of freedom from versus dependence on the global economy. They spoke of internationalism versus nationalism, sovereignty, and its violation. They promoted autarky, self-sufficiency, and economic insulation. But their message was very clear. The global economy's traumatic fluctuations had made their lives more insecure, their families more unsettled, societies more unequal. They believed that the ties that bound the world together needed to be undone. In my talk today and in my broader project, I use the term anti-globalism to refer to political, social, or cultural movements that sought to insulate societies from the global economy by mobilizing against people, policies, institutions, and processes that were associated with globalism or internationalism. Sometimes these movements produced deglobalization, the actual slowdown or curtailment of transnational mobility. Anti-globalism and deglobalization are not simply aliases for nationalism, which has long been recognized as a defining political force throughout the world in 1918. Nationalism and anti-globalism are often closely related, but while many anti-globalists were nationalists, not all nationalists were anti-globalists. Of course, we cannot separate deglobalization from globalization itself any more than we can separate nationalism and internationalism. The two can only be understood in relationship and reaction to one another. Anti-globalists themselves often organized in transnational or global networks, a fact that was often noted by contemporaries. Quote, "The only international which seems to be winning these days is the international of the anti-internationalists," quipped journalist Dorothy Thompson in 1931. And yet historians have spent the last several decades combing archives for examples of transnational and global connection, but largely ignored reactions or resistance to globalism or globalization. And this, I think, was itself a reflection of the era of globalization between 1989 and 2008, when we produced hundreds of books investigating the history of internationalism and the transnational or global movement of people, ideas, and goods. We were all, myself included, looking to see beyond the nation state because it reflected the world in which we lived. This project is no less a history of the present. Deglobalization reshaped societies globally. Between the two world wars, there were powerful anti-global movements in the United States, Ireland, India, England, Japan, Turkey, Spain, Germany, and Italy, just to name a few. Anti-global ideas and policies gained credit among imperialists and anti-colonial nationalists in states that had won the First World War and states that had lost, on the far right and the far left. And in my larger project, I focus on several of these movements in the US and in Europe. But this is the con lecture, and so today I'm going to focus more deeply on interwar Austria, which was an epicenter of anti-globalism and deglobalization with a post-imperial accent. The dissolution of the Habsburg, Ottoman, and Romanov empires meant that Europe now had 38 economic units instead of 26, 27 different currencies instead of 13, and customs frontiers that extended an additional 6,000 to 7,000 kilometers. Historian Andrea Komlosy has argued that the Habsburg Empire itself represented a kind of miniature global economy. That perception was shared by contemporaries, and the empire's dissolution into warring nation-states, each with policies of extreme economic nationalism, was perceived at the time as a microcosm of the global economy's implosion. And most people in this audience don't need to see this map, but I've put one up so you can see how the map of Europe changed after 1914. As Natasha Wheatley has argued, Central Europe was also a ground zero for the construction of a new international order after World War I. On the surface, this might seem to contradict the idea of the interwar era as an anti-global moment. But internationalists descended on Central Europe not only because the Habsburg successor states were seen to be semi-sovereign and immature democracies in need of Western tutelage. In realms as varied as economics and finance, hunger and food, migration, minority rights, statelessness, and the control of epidemics, new international organizations swarmed the former Habsburg lands precisely in order to assist the victims of deglobalization and to piece together shards of shattered economic and institutional networks. Austria, like Germany, was also an epicenter of anti-globalism because the Paris peace treaties had transformed large sectors of the population into bitter critics of globalism and liberal internationalism. That bitterness was exacerbated by hunger. During the First World War, Britain had imposed a successful naval blockade on Germany and Austria-Hungary. The effects of the civilian blockade have been disputed ever since the end of the war, but regardless of the actual body count, it was widely associated and remembered as the cause of mass starvation. And here's a kind of famous image from the American Relief Administration that an organization that assisted hungry children in Austria in the name of fighting communism. The lesson that Central Europeans learned from this experience was that they should never again be dependent on foreign imports to feed themselves. But as a result of the Paris peace treaties, Austria had lost around 60% of its former territory and 3/4 of its population, including its industrial heartland in Bohemia and its precious oil and grain fields in Galicia. Some Central Europeans, of course, hoped that trade relations between former Habsburg lands could be revived. Oscar Yazzie famously insisted that only a United States of the Danube with free trade between its members could guarantee the economic viability and security of the Habsburg successor states. Significantly, Yazzie promoted federation as a means of achieving economic autarky for the Danube Federation, which he called an intrinsic test of a viable polity. The United States of the Danube, he argued, would possess, quote, such a wealth of natural, climatological, and ethnographic resources that autarky would be more attainable in this imagined state than in almost any other polity in world history. But newly empowered nationalist regimes in Belgrade, Bucharest, and Prague had no interest in a Danube federation that sounded an awful lot like the Habsburg Empire. In Austria, meanwhile, most citizens chose to look toward Germany rather than Hungary for economic salvation. Historians have long observed that Austrian demands for Anschluss with Germany in 1918 were a product of anxieties about economic survival. But these demands should also be situated in the broader context of deglobalization. It was not simply that Austria had shrunk to a pitiful rump state. The problem was that even as the logic of deglobalization and national self-determination seemed to require the creation of small states between Germany and Russia, tariff walls, economic nationalism, and migration restriction made the survival of these small states more difficult than ever. The consensus was that Austria could not feed itself. The Neue Freie Presse stated in 1919, "We cannot become a sort of poorhouse of Europe that is maintained by charitable donations. A state can only remain upright if it has the basic requirements for viability. The regions that once supplied us with food in exchange for industrial products are now closed off and have spiteful economic policies." Karl Renner, Austria's first chancellor, believed that the First World War had actually been waged between two imperialisms, that of the Allies and that of the Central Powers, for domination of the global economy. But in the end, he concluded, it was the global economy itself that was defeated. Quote, "As a consequence of the war, we not only have no free trade, but protective tariffs in every country, direct barriers against foreign goods, and often against foreign people. In the place of the freedom of all nations, for the first time in history, we have a situation in which entire nations are in debt slavery to others." Popular protests echoed these sentiments. A petition from the Lower Austrian Business Association warned that the Austrian state would be not only economically unviable, but also perpetually subservient, reduced to a colonial vassal or slave colony. Larry Wolff has recently suggested that Woodrow Wilson and his advisors encouraged the use of the language of slavery and emancipation in Central Europe after the war. Wilson, in spite of his record of segregating the federal government, liked to compare himself to Lincoln and saw himself as an emancipator of the so-called enslaved peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. And that language was widely appropriated by Europeans protesting the peace treaties. A telegram issued by members of the Austrian Christian Social Party and German Freedom Party in May 1919 warned, "We will not allow ourselves with our wives and children to be sentenced to death or eternal economic slavery. If the Entente wants to prepare a grave for us, all of Europe will be destroyed with us." When these protesters invoked slavery, they were talking specifically about dependence on the global economy for food supplies and subservience to foreign powers. The opposite of slavery, in their imagination, was greater self-sufficiency at the level of the individual and the nation. The first step on the road to self-sufficiency was to plant a garden. The size, place, and kind of garden was subject to debate. What would ultimately be called the settlement movement in Austria began at the grassroots as Austrians literally tried to raise food from grass and from roots. This movement included many different and sometimes competing plans for achieving greater self-sufficiency in food production, from the creation of small urban gardens to suburban garden cities to the full-blown colonization of supposedly underutilized farmland. All of these ideas had international origins and predated the First World War. They were all originally imagined as solutions to a diverse range of social and political and cultural problems, ranging from housing shortages to unemployment to all of the social, cultural, and biological dangers associated with urbanization. But during and after the First World War, the settlement movement gained new meaning in the campaign for greater self-sufficiency. In Vienna, so-called wild settlements spread around the city before the war ended as unemployed workers and returning soldiers occupied parkland, built dwellings out of wood planks, waste material, and dirt, and ate what they could grow. In 1915, Viennese city officials ordered that potatoes be planted in parks. There were at least 70,000 Viennese allotment gardeners at the end of the war, and they organized themselves into a mass movement demanding government support. In one protest, 100,000 settlers marched on the Ringstrasse, shouting slogans like, quote, settlers cooperatives instead of emigration. The movement was explicitly about turning inward rather than outward, colonizing the homeland instead of colonizing the rest of the world, or emigrating to the rest of the world. Quote, inner colonization is pure colonial politics, explained the Austrian Kronenzeitung. The only difference is that it does not involve the colonization of some foreign land, but rather the colonization of our own homeland. The settlement movement was, like anti-globalism more broadly, politically promiscuous. While some people were desperate for food, pragmatists mixed with returning veterans, socialists, anarchists, life reformers, and those who saw settlements as an alternative to capitalist society. On all sides of the political spectrum, however, the movement was linked to fantasies of autarky. Settlement advocate Hans Kampfmeyer put it simply in 1926, the less food Austria has to get from abroad, the better it is for its national economy. Settlement activists frequently invoke the consequences of the First World War and the collapse of global trade in justifying their demands. Before the First World War, the treasures of the entire earth were available to the European economy. This situation has fundamentally changed. It was now necessary for Austrians to exploit their, quote, shrunken Lebensraum in order to open up every possibility that will offer the population the possibility of producing life's necessities from the land. It was in this spirit that in September 1926, Josef Wagner and Franz Reichert led a convoy of 60 unemployed workers from Vienna to an abandoned tract of swampy land in Oberau in Lower Austria. The men came on foot and on trucks armed with hoes and hacksaws. They called their movement Colonies in the Homeland. Wagner and his group had applied for a state fund for veterans for money to settle 120 people. When their application was rejected, they took matters into their own hands. They began cutting down trees and making demands. They would evacuate only if given a large plot of land close to Vienna. This occupation attracted widespread attention from the press and parliament. Otto Bauer, the leader of the Austrian Social Democrats, blamed the government for encouraging, quote, the displacement of local agricultural workers by Slovak migrant workers. But the problem from the perspective of the agriculture ministry was that the land that the settlers had chosen had no access to clean drinking water. It was unsanitary, swampy, and the site of a recent malaria outbreak. The standoff continued for 29 days until the ministry finally gave in, and eventually around 60 families received 2.8 acres each in a region outside of Vienna. Members of colonies in the homeland and its offshoots ultimately created 5 different settlements. Requests for support for settlement projects soon flooded government offices. One group of prospective settlers in 1927 invoked the consequences of the dismemberment of the Habsburg Empire. The loss of our once large economic territory has had catastrophic effects. It is the duty of all far-sighted statesmen to devote every possible effort to save our people from their downfall. That requires inner colonization. Petitioners repeatedly compared their plans for inner colonization favorably to schemes for overseas settlement. While overseas emigration entailed the, quote, departure of the most valuable part of the population, intercolonization would preserve valuable resources for the homeland. Initially, the settlement movement had strong ties to social democracy and pre-war life reform movements. Vienna's first social democratic mayor, Jakob Reumann, was a critical ally. In 1920, Otto Neurath, the Vienna Circle philosopher and social democrat, co-founded the Austrian Association for Settlement and Small Gardens with Hans Kampfmeyer, a leader of the German Garden City movement. That association created an annual exhibition for settlement on the Rathausplatz, which was attended by 400,000 people per week in 1923. The association also created a settler school in 1921 and recruited renowned architects, including Adolf Loos, Josef Frank, and Margareta Schutte-Lehotzky. Loos, who was appointed chief architect of Vienna's municipal settlement office in 1922, believed that the movement was nothing less than revolutionary. Quote, "This new movement, which has infested all of the residents of the city like a fever, the settlement movement, demands new humans," he wrote. Autarkic ideals were fundamental to his vision. "One often used to speak of Austrian cuisine," he wrote. "Only today we have realized that this cuisine was only possible because there was a state form called the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Now that the monarchy was defunct," he argued, "we need to create our own national cuisine. The Bohemian dumpling, the Moravian buchtel, the Italian schnitzel, all things that were an unshakable part of Viennese cuisine for centuries must now be replaced by local foods." Local foods were to be cooked in ideal settlers' homes, designed by Loos and Schutte-Lehotzky, and here's one home designed by Loos. These homes were to be filled with light and air and a rational organization of space, equipped with large gardens for self-provisioning. The modern built-in kitchens Schutte-Lehotzky designed for the first settlement homes outside of Vienna were a prototype for the Frankfurt kitchen, for which she later became famous. On the left, you have a picture of the kitchen she designed for the settlers' homes, and on the right, the Frankfurt kitchen. But while progressive urban reformers and architects endorsed settlers' ambitions, Viennese socialist government gradually began to distance itself from the settlement movement in the 1920s. Instead of designing suburban settlements and single-family homes, the city planners of Red Vienna shifted toward large-scale urban apartment complexes. The percentage of new homes in Vienna designed for settlers declined from 54% in 1921 to 4% in 1925. Loos resigned from the municipal settlement office in protest in 1924 after his plans for a garden settlement were rejected, and Schutte-Lehotzky left for Frankfurt in 1926. Increasingly, the settlement movement shifted to the right. Red Vienna's shift toward the mass housing complex was animated precisely by concern that workers who spent too much time gardening would have no time for political meetings. On the right, meanwhile, many supporters supported settlements because they seemed to reduce the threat of working-class political agitation. They also hoped that settlements would restore traditional gender and family roles. Albert Gessmann, who co-founded the Christian Social Party with Karl Lueger, became a strong supporter of the movement in the 1930s. In 1932, Gessmann claimed that in these settlements, quote, "the work of the children by the mother's side will have beneficial effects on the education of the children and give new meaning to the family life of the worker." In fact, female settlers often had a particularly hard life, working 13 to 14-hour days to create so-called self-sufficient households. Conservative women, however, praised settlements as the solution to what they called the new female question. In 1932, Clara Friedlander, vice president of the Austrian Women's Party, commended settlers' wives for giving up paid work, leaving their jobs free for men. Quote, "Among settlers, marriage recovers its old meaning, a union of equals founded to raise the next generation." In Austria and beyond, anti-globalists often promoted settlement in terms of a supposed return to more traditional gender roles. They associated the global economy and its implosion and its fluctuations with the disruption of those roles. Mass migration had broken up families. Male unemployment during the Depression threatened the role of men as providers. The settlement movement promised to enable men to become self-sufficient providers once again. It would also bring care work and production that had been outsourced back into the home and into the family. Indeed, the entire homesteading ideal relied on a great deal of unpaid labor by women and children. While many Austrian social democrats remained uneasy about settlement projects throughout the late 1920s, the Great Depression and mass unemployment cured them somewhat of this ambivalence. In the early 1930s, rural settlement, self-sufficiency, and intercolonization appeared to offer a last hope for shelter from the free-falling global economy. Even socialists supported Vienna's so-called Stadtratssiedlung, a settlement on the edge of the city in 1932, choosing settlers based in part on their loyalty to the Socialist Party. Here's a poster advertising or settlement, and I'm going to show you a few pictures of the settlements during the Great Depression from the Austrian National Library that give you a sense of what they looked like. Then, under the authoritarian Dollfuss regime beginning in 1932, Interior Minister Franz Bachinger of the Austrian Landbund continued to promote settlement as a way out of the economic abyss. In 1933, he wrote, "In the context of the great economic difficulties of the present, urban circles have made a discovery that is inborn to those of us in the countryside. A nation must ultimately live from what its own land produces." Not everyone got on the bandwagon, of course. Editors of the liberal Österreichische Volkswirt jabbed in 1932, "It is difficult to imagine something more absurd than aspirations for autarky in such an exceptionally interdependent country like Austria." The liberal Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises was more emphatic. "An economic policy that strives for autarky would mean the downfall of European culture," he wrote. Quinn Slobodian has argued that Austrian economists like von Mises developed what we now think of as neoliberal economic principles in response to the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and interwar anti-globalism. They insisted on the need for state and international institutions that would protect markets from the intervention of nationalist, socialist, and anti-global political movements. But von Mises was firmly in the minority in the 1930s. Instead, experts and activists across party and political lines shared the goals of achieving self-sufficiency at the national and individual level, along with combating unemployment. They shared biopolitical aims as well. Rural settlement was supposed to improve the health, welfare, and family life of working-class Austrians. But this does not mean that left and right-wing forms of anti-globalism were the same. On the right, anti-globalists typically imagined the nation as the primary victim of globalization and internationalism. Their enemies included Jews, Bolshevik internationalists, liberal internationalists, feminist internationalists, migrants and refugees, foreigners, and foreign capitalists. Anti-globalists on the left, meanwhile, were not necessarily anti-nationalist, but they generally depicted the worker rather than the nation as the primary victim of globalization, understanding it in terms of capitalist exploitation. Many left-wing anti-globalists saw rural homesteads and home production as a shelter from the fluctuations of the business cycle. But they simultaneously demanded land reform and new forms of social protection to address the instability and inequality generated by the global economy. They also saw no contradiction between economic self-sufficiency and political internationalism, with some arguing that greater self-sufficiency would produce a more universalist and true form of globalism or internationalism. The settlement movement had very mixed results, as you can imagine. Austrian farmers did produce 3 times as many potatoes in 1931 as they had in 1919, 20 times as much sugar, and 10 times as much milk. But the reality of settler life was often harsh and disappointing. And here's a slide, I think, that evokes the barrenness of this landscape. Settlers in Leopoldau on the outskirts of Vienna had no schools, doctors, public transit, gas, electricity, sewage, or stores in the 1930s. They were hungry and cold due to a lack of heating. There was never any food left to sell, and alcoholism was rampant. One settlement advocate actually suggested that settlers trade meat and potatoes for a local diet consisting solely of chestnuts, goat milk, and apples. Autarky was never realistic. And Austrians eventually returned to the solution they had demanded in 1918, Anschluss. When the Nazis came to power in Germany and eventually in Austria, they did so on a surge of anti-global rhetoric. In the July 1932 election campaign, Hitler proclaimed, there's so much international, so much world conscience. There's the League of Nations, the Disarmament Conference, Moscow, the Second International, the Third International. And what did all that produce for Germany? The ideal of Blut und Boden was formed in opposition to Jewish cosmopolitanism, migration, liberal internationalism, and the global economy. At the first Reich Farmer Day in 1934, Undersecretary of Agriculture Herbert Backe lamented that in previous decades, quote, the relationship between the folk and its territory was blown up by the transnational global economy. Individuals no longer felt bound to the folk to which they belonged by blood, did not feel rooted in their native soil, but instead belonged above all to a global economic community. The Nazis planned to reverse all that. Hitler had announced his first four-year plan to achieve autarky in 1936, and by 1939, Germany claimed to be 83% self-sufficient in food production. But even as Nazi propaganda called upon German women to spin their own cloth and grow their own food, experts behind the scenes conceded that autarky was not a realistic goal for Germany. One official in the Reichsbank confessed, quote, even if we had 20 million sheep, we would only be able to produce 20% of the wool we consume domestically. Anti-globalism ultimately was both a product of imperial collapse and ultimately became a source of new imperial projects. The breakup of empires stimulated populist movements for greater autonomy from the global economy. But when autarky proved unachievable, as it did in Nazi Germany, policymakers shifted their sights toward achieving autarky for continental Europe, dominated by Germany. The Nazi ideal of Großraumwirtschaft, or a large regional economy, resembled the Danube Federation or the pan-European ideal that would inform the European Union, except that it was to serve only German economic interests and was justified with a language of racial and cultural superiority that devalued all non-German lives. In April 1938, Der Siedler, the publication of the Austrian Association for Settlement, celebrated the Anschluss with a portrait of Adolf Hitler on its cover, proclaiming Hitler the liberator of his homeland. Editors claimed, the first days of this victory without precedent have hardly passed, and the powerful Reich is already extending a helping hand to settlers in Austria. The realization of a dream of a single family home with a garden is nearly a palpable reality for even the poorest settler who is ready to work. Local Nazi party leaders were instructed to select settlers with German or similar blood who demonstrated a, quote, strong determination to create a family with children. Settlers were also instructed that their homes should be made out of only local materials and adhere to local architectural styles and forms. The expansion of settlements in Nazi Germany went hand in hand with the removal of Jews and Slavs. One Nazi report concluded that it would be impossible to evaluate the full progress of the settlement movement on the Austrian border with Czechoslovakia, quote, until the full effects of the removal of Czechs and Jews is determined. For the Nazis, there was no question that the settlement movement represented the antithesis of globalism. Internationalists could not be settlers, one official argued, since, quote, whoever is oriented internationally has no appreciation of home, of homeland, or for the attachment to the land and therefore to the fatherland. I could conclude here in 1938, but that would be a mistake. The interwar drive for self-sufficiency certainly justified racist forms of imperial conquest, restrictions on migration, and a return to traditional gender roles. It helped produce the cult of the single-family home and garden. But it also inspired initiatives that improved people's lives, from urban gardens to social policies that reduced the precarity caused by the instability of the global economy. Alongside movements for local foods and home production, it stimulated the creation of synthetic substitutes designed to decrease reliance on imports. And it galvanized efforts to increase agricultural production, including technologies that made land more productive and actually reduced hunger globally. In my talk today, I've attempted to reframe the history of interwar Austria in terms of deglobalization and anti-globalism. Inevitably, I have raised questions about our own anti-global moment. This project was inspired by contemporary events. I began my research in 2015-16. There was a refugee crisis, Donald Trump was elected, There was the vote for Brexit, the rise of right-wing populist regimes in Poland and Hungary, and anti-migrant voices everywhere, including Austria. And then came the pandemic. In the United States, people are allegedly fleeing cities, seeking homes with gardens where they can socially distance. Local foods and homespun goods have never been more popular, as anti-globalism now has a new focus on environmental sustainability. A move toward self-sufficiency is also evident in Europe. In the wake of the coronavirus, quote, Austria has to become more self-sufficient, argued Marion Rauner, an Austrian economist and expert in disaster management. In May 2020, she insisted that Austria needed to produce more of its own food and medical products or rely on close neighbors. Quote, it makes a difference whether drugs come in a few hours by truck or rail from the Czech Republic, for example, or in a few hours by ship from countries on the Danube, or whether you have to wait more than 6 weeks for a container coming from China. It's a good moment to examine the last major era of anti-globalism, to remember the extent to which globalization is not unstoppable or inevitable. But this is not primarily, for me at least, a project about what the past can teach us about the present. Rather, I have been more struck by the ways in which the present has reshaped my understanding of the past, from the effects of the First World War and the Great Depression to the rise of fascism. In particular, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire looks different when viewed not only through the lens of war, nationalism, social conflict, or anti-imperialism, but as an epicenter of deglobalization. Between the two world wars, the continent was rebuilt to insulate and protect people from globalization's perceived and real negative consequences. After 1945, international leaders and activists would renew efforts to create a more equitable and sustainable form of globalization and internationalism. Whether or not they succeeded remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tara, for really a marvelous lecture there, a big, broad, bold overview. I'm sure we have a lot of questions here. We weren't quite sure what our audience would be, but since we had close to 200 participants, I think we would ask you to use the chat box, and then I will help moderate and sort of if you could put your name and your question in. I see one from Dominique Ryle already, and Dominique, could you just unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
All right, this is so great, and I have a million questions, but I know I should only ask one. There's this fascinating tension between globalism and anti-globalism and imperialism and post-imperialism, and I was wondering how much you see this wanting to go inward of these families and these activists as also a kind of anger at being given value systems and educations and trainings around systems that now are completely no longer relevant because their state is gone. Their mathematics charts, they're learning how you do things. They're in a totally different world. So I'm wondering also, do you see something different in parts of Europe whose empires grew after the war? There are a million more questions, but those are just two.
Thank you, Dominique. You always have the best questions. I hadn't actually thought about the idea of people who had been sort of trained for a global world, like the functionaries of, I guess, even thinking about the civil servants of the Austrian Empire being among the primary anti-globalists. But I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's something that I should look into, actually. Because
that gender stuff could really be also about, well,
yeah,
what are our values now? We're in a new state.
So much for learning all those languages, right? That kind of thing. So I think that's a very interesting idea. And then the question about, it's an interesting idea that I want to look into more. The question about empire is also very interesting. So one of the things I'm still trying to figure out in this project, and that I was very silent on, is the place of places like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland in this moment. And what I had been thinking about is the ways in which these are sort of extraordinarily nationalist societies after 1918, but not necessarily anti-global in their political orientation or anti-international. And that may be largely because they are the winners in 1918. At the same time, looking beyond Central Europe, it's clear that in places like Britain, there's a kind of increasing movement to look toward empire as a kind of substitute for a global economy. So the empire trade movement, for example, is explicitly based on the idea that we need to sort of create a free trade network within our empire at the expense of those outside of it. So I see this as kind of something that happens in post-imperial societies and in empires that still stand or are expanding.
Thank you. We're beginning to get a queue of questions here. I wonder, Zahra, would you be okay if Scott Spector and Andrea Orzoff are the next two in line, if we had them both ask their questions and then you can answer them one after another? Would that be all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Okay. Scott and then Andrea, please ask your question.
I'll try to be quick. I mean, first, you are so wonderful. So that's all. It was great. My question is just, I'll try to do it quickly. You mainly focus so much on wresting the structural movements of toward and away from globalism in Austria, and I guess, also I can extrapolate to other successor states, along the lines that you were just saying, but to wrest those movements toward and away from the grip of nationalism. That was very persuasive. But, you also loosen the grip more of ideologies more generally. And that's salutary too. But, if globalism was definitely not in the contemporary discourse, as you say, internationalism definitely was. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to come to terms with what you've convinced me on one hand, and the way that I still take very seriously, the hope and the really great hope and really great fear among maybe most people, of the political actors of Marxist revolution. That was very alive. So, the sort of structural analysis makes me ask, what role is this very live ideology in exactly this period?
Great, thank you. Is Andrea going to ask her question, or should I answer Scott's?
Andrea, would you like to ask your question as well?
Sure, I'm happy to be part of the queue. Tara, thank you as always for such a fascinating and stimulating talk. And hello, it's lovely to see you. So you've already answered one of my questions, which is about Czechoslovakia. And I'm curious to see the direction that your research takes you with regard to Czechoslovakia and the other little Entente countries, right? The politics for whom are simultaneously international and national because they're so interdependent. But my other question is, your talk made me think about some of the themes in the interwar period with regard to high culture. And I wonder if you've pulled issues of high culture. You'll only be able to cover so much, it's one book. But I'm curious, for example, about whether the sort of nationalist or folk turn in musically speaking would be relevant to or related to your work, even though that does predate the settlement movement somewhat, right? Or the tendency, not just from the Nazis, right, but from other countries as well, to claim artists that relied on international inspiration or whose lives were inherently transnational as emanations of the natural, of the national spirit, right? The sort of Geist of the nation. So I'm just curious about where high culture might fit into this paradigm that you present of deglobalization. Thanks.
Thank you to both Scott and Andrea. It's great to see both of you. Scott, your question initially brought me back to my first year graduate course on ideology, and I got scared for a second. But I also realized early on in with this project that that the point is not actually, as it may have sounded like in my introduction, to decenter the importance of internationalism as a deeply felt and significant ideology and force in the interwar period. I realized actually that I needed to write chapters on how internationalists themselves were thinking about and coping with what they themselves saw as an anti-global or anti-international moment. And the kind of, the early sort of thought I have about this is based mainly on work in the archives of the League of Nations, where particularly in the aftermath of some great perceived failures, the World Economic Conference, the Disarmament Conference, you see certain thinkers, particularly, I've been looking at the realm of food and agriculture, but really trying to rethink globalization and internationalism ideologically in new ways, to sort of present it in new ways, but also to reformulate it so that it could actually be more genuinely equitable. So the sort of turn toward the ideal of standard of living and anti-poverty movements that kind of then informs later development projects after World War II is in some ways a response to the perceived failures of interwar internationalism to get mass buy-in in a way. So that's like actually a pretty important story, not just the sort of, it's not just a story of the downfall of internationalism, but of efforts by internationalists to respond to what they see and to create a new order for the post-war period. I think the same is true. One could say the same is true in a way for Marxists and for anti-colonial nationalists. So one of the places I've been looking is to Gandhi and India, where there's a kind of combination between a political movement for economic self-sufficiency and a strong globalist and internationalist ideology. And there the argument, I think this is true for many socialists, is that greater self-sufficiency is actually going to lead us to a more true universalist and genuine form of globalism and internationalism, which is not based on exploitation and on empire and inequality, but rather on a kind of more universalist ideal. But it's something I'm still thinking about. And there are many other ways to take that story. Andrea, high culture, I think I haven't really looked at it, but I think it fits and I think it would be really fascinating. The little bits and pieces that I've seen have had to do with kind of the creation of self-sufficiency in cultural production of various kinds, whether it's music, fashion, language. You see a lot of discussion of sort of an attempt to return to local forms or a validation of local or national rather than cosmopolitan forms of culture. But it's not something I've really devoted myself to. So, but I would like to know more. And I hope that somebody else will do that work. I think it would be really interesting.
Great. We have a very long queue of questions, and we also have to consider, though, that you have been up for a while. So I know, obviously, we're not going to be able to get to everything. So why don't I just throw one more question out there? We've had quite an international, quite a global audience for this, from India to Belarus. But a colleague from Belarus has written in this question that perhaps we can close with. Thank you very much for the inspiring lecture. I'd like to ask if we can consider the emergence of the Soviet Union on the ruins of the Russian Empire in 1922 as a new form of internationalism and globalism, or whether it was rather an imperial than an international project.
Thank you for that question. Russia sits in many ways as a kind of elephant in the room in this project. I would say that the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union changed over time, but in many ways, it represented a form of an inspiration for many anti-globalists on the continent, surprisingly, even as it had this internationalist ideology. And regardless of what the actual truth was of Soviet economic policies, there's been recent work saying, okay, actually, there was never really a Soviet drive for autarky. From the outside, especially in the 1930s when the Depression hit, it was people believed that the Soviet Union was weathering the Depression better than other states in Europe, precisely because it had a greater level of autarky. So the Soviet Union and the United States were actually often upheld by Hitler, for example, as the example of the kind of autarkic empires that other states like Germany and Italy were striving to achieve. And England was the British Empire was the third example that was often used. So I would say it was both. And, one of the things I'm trying to argue is that in the 30s, what you see is this turn toward what I'm calling anti-global empires. The Soviet Union is kind of one of them. The idea is to have an empire that enables you to be less dependent on the global economy and on international politics, and better able to withstand a blockade or any other kind of breakdown of supply chains in the event of war.
Terrific, thank you. If I could perhaps ask one other person to give a question. There are many, many questions, but I do want to sort of acknowledge our global audience in this as well, and people who are staying up in strange time zones for this. And we do have a question from India. So Ambika Natarajan, if you're still with us, could you jump in with your question? And then I'm afraid we will have to shut down.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was so lovely. I had a question so you commented on Trump, about how the present context influenced this project. I wonder if you could also comment about the present situation in Austria, like with Sebastian Kurz got elected in 2017. And I was wondering if you could make some comments on this present situation, on this globalization project and what's happening in Austria, and as well as make some comments on the green movement in particular, because these settlement garden type things are also talked a lot about in the green movement.
Thank you for that question and for tuning in. I think that what we see in Austria right now is quite similar to movements globally, which is a strange sort of convergence of anti-globalism on the left and the right. So, which is, again, not to say that they're the same. And that's why I kind of made that point forcefully, or tried to make it forcefully, about the interwar period. Just because there's a kind of set of parallel goals doesn't mean that these two movements are the same. But it is striking, I think, that sort of movements for local foods and home production and settlement and homesteading are quite popular on the far left and the far right. I think the distinction, as in the interwar period, and this is where the parallel does kind of work, is who are who's seen as the victim of globalization? Is it the nation or a particular racial group? Or is it the worker or the peasant or some other group? And what kinds of solutions are imagined? I think, this is true in Austria, but also in the United States and elsewhere, that there's a very strong difference between how the left and the right imagine the solutions to what they see as a kind of the problem of globalization gone rampant or amok.
Thank you very much. And I think we would all like to thank Tara for her marvelous lecture. This Q&A time as well. I'm sorry that we are sort of cutting it short. I would encourage those of you who have questions, though. I'm sure she would solicit them herself, that she is reachable by email and other ways of connecting with her, and would be happy to take some questions. You can write us as well at the Center for Austrian Studies, and we can pass on questions as well at casahy@umn.edu. I'd also like to note in closing that the next of these events from the North American series is on October 6th with Wolfgang Petrich, and would encourage you all to come to that and other events of the Center for Austrian Studies this fall as well. Thank you, Tara, very much. Thank you all for listening, and I think all went well. So a round of applause to all of us for pulling through with close to 200 people at points with this and crossing many time zones. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.